Hello and welcome to Learning HTML for Complete Beginners. Now this video is the first in a course of videos in teaching basic HTML. Now we'll be focusing on HTML5, which is the latest edition of HTML. We won't be looking at CSS too deeply, only in so much as how it ties in with the basics of CSS. At the end of this video, we'll be building a simple web page. So you might be thinking, well, where do I start with creating a HTML website? Well, there's only two things that you need. You need a browser to open up the HTML page. So when we click on the HTML file, it will open up into the browser by default, and a code or text editor. There is a whole host of choices for browsers, but I choose Brave. And in terms of text or code editors, there is a whole host of those as well. I learnt to code off Atom. There is Sublime Text, which is also another text editor. And then there's WebStorm, which is a IDE, which is an integrated development environment. You do have to pay for this, but it is a professional bit of kit that most agencies, software houses use. It's a very good product, but it might be overkill for what we need. And then there's Visual Studio Code, which is a low-end IDE, and it's also a very good code editor, and it can scale up to a decent IDE. Not as good as WebStorm, but more importantly, it's free. After the two, I would choose Visual Studio Code and Brave, but it's completely up to you. You could even use Internet Explorer 11 or Notepad. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can do whatever you want to start with HTML. Now, what is HTML? Well, let's find out. So HTML is an acronym for Hypertext Markup Language. It's a markup language created by Tim Berners-Lee as he was working at CERN when he was creating the World Wide Web. It was used to transmit documents across the internet through the World Wide Web and show people structured layouts through this markup language. Now, just to reiterate, this is not a programming language. It's not what they call Turing complete. It is not functional. It is a markup language. So it's purely for skeletal layout builds. It is to build the skeleton of a website. So how does HTML actually help? Well, HTML elements themselves are building blocks of the web, as we'll see shortly. It's also how browsers read your website. They look for HTML that dictates which section of the site you want to do what, where certain information is, and what users should really be focusing on. And it's great for screen readers and things like that. HTML plays a huge part in the web, and without it there would be no World Wide Web. Now, to be able to see a website, you need to put it on a web host for others to see. And that's essentially how the World Wide Web has grown. A collection of shared documents for other people to see. Now, to create a HTML file, you simply create a new file with whatever name you want, and then at the very end you add a .html extension, and that produces a HTML file. When you double left click that file, it'll try to open up in a browser by default unless you've changed it to do something else. And now it can open in any browser, it depends whatever your default is. And if you were to go to the web directory your website is held in, either online or in a browser, you will find that if you haven't named your homepage or your main website index.html, it'll actually come up blank. The reason being is, by default, they look for the index.html, and if it isn't there, it turns up blank. So if you call it main.html, it won't show anything unless you've set up a redirect or you've made some other way of showing that page or telling the browser that that's what you want to show. So as a best practice, I would suggest naming your main entry-level web page or your homepage index.html. And if you want to send people elsewhere, you need to set up some kind of redirect or some way of telling the browser that they should actually be looking at main.html or whatever other file it is. Now, what is the HTML element tag syntax? Well, HTML is mostly a start tag and an end tag that wraps around content. So in the example of A, you can see that the content is wrapped by a p tag, which is a paragraph tag. And at the very start, you have it in the brackets and the p in the center to dictate that this is a paragraph tag, and at the very end it's the same. However, it is denoted that it is an end tag by the / at the front of the p, and that says that this tag is a closing tag, and therefore the content has finished for this element. Now there is also self-closing tags. So these are tags that don't need to wrap the content, and in fact they're almost like inline elements that they just stay there and you can close within themselves. So this BR example in B, or a break element, creates a space, and all it needs is just the BR itself within the brackets and a /, and also image as well. You can self-close an image element. Now luckily in HTML5 you don't need the /, so you can get away with doing a BR tag and an image tag just without it. Now semantic HTML is a huge part of how the web works. Going forward, a lot of the big browsers are pushing for semantic HTML and are favouring websites with semantic HTML. So if you look at the image on the right, you can see that the header is clearly dictated that it is the header by its name, and the nav being the navigation, the section denoting that this is a separate section, so you can have multiple sections, an article for a post, a blog post, so you can have multiple ones of those, a side to show this is a bit of content to the side, so like a side menu or something, and then the footer obviously. So semantic HTML describes what essentially the element is being used for, and it tells the browser that this specifically is what it's being used for. Whereas in the past that's not been the case. It's been very haphazard, there's not been much of a standard. Whereas this is bringing more of a standard to the web, which is a brilliant move forward. Because before, people would be using divs and spans haphazardly, and even before then, in the darkest of days, people were using tables for everything. We don't want to go back to that. Now there's two types of HTML elements. There's block level and inline level elements. A block level element takes up the entire line of space and pushes below the content above and creates what we call in HTML a block element. So an example of that is a div element, an image element, the header element, so h1 to h6, paragraph form, etc. Those are primitive block elements. Now inline does the opposite. It does not take the entire width, it just takes the space that it's within, and it does not push itself below other content. So inline elements could be anchor tags, the A tag, spans, and images. So with all that out the way, let's jump into some code. So let's start making our website. Now what we need to do is make sure we've created a blank folder and opened it with our code editor. You can name the blank folder whatever you want. In this case, I've called it Learn HTML. Now that it's open with this, I've also opened it in my browser and made sure that my blank folder is open there as well. And I'm using Live Server to load the server in Visual Studio Code, which is an extension you can download, which simply means any changes get automatically reloaded in there. There we go. It's one of the great things about Visual Studio Code that it has such a huge extension ecosystem that you can use. And Live Server is one of the great tools that you can use on Visual Studio Code, just to spin up a quick development environment that actually shows you changes. Right, so if you go back, now what we're going to do is we are going to create our first HTML file. So if we go here and we click this, and because it's our home page, we'll call it index.html and add the HTML extension. And automatically the code editor has recognized that this is a HTML file. So that's all well and good, but we need to let the browser know that this is also a HTML file. And to do that, we need to add a doc type at the very start of the page. So we have to add some curly brackets like this, not curly, pointy brackets like this, and then add an exclamation point and add the doc type. And then we'll set it to HTML. Now, doc type isn't case sensitive, So you can type it however you want. You could do it like this in camel case, or you could do it like this, but I prefer uppercase just as I feel like that's the convention now. What we also need to do is add the HTML element to wrap the entire site as a top level element. And this will basically set your site as a HTML document. We will set the language on here as English. Now, it's one of the things about HTML elements, they've all got their own properties or attributes as we call them. And HTML has one called lang, and there are many others that are common and shared between other HTML elements, which we will go into later. So we're going to add two more primitive elements to the website that are very important. So the other one being head, and the latter being body. Now, the head contains information about the web page itself, so metadata, title information, links to style sheets, for example, or other external files that you might want to include on the web page. And the body is simply the body of the page. It contains all the content, it contains all the layout work. So what we'll do in the head for now, just to keep it simple, is we will add a title. So if we add a title element and we will say learn HTML, we can see in here that it currently says error. So if we save that and refresh this, it now says learn HTML. So we have changed the page information there with the title, and that is the purpose of head. With body, what we'll do is we will add a div, and we'll start adding content. So a div element is like a container class almost. It's a very basic and standard class that you'll see almost everywhere in HTML. And what we'll do is we will add a class of hello world. Now what a class does is that essentially assigns it as selector, because what we want to do is we want to assign almost like a name to this div, and it will be useful later on for styling, which I'll show you shortly. Now within here, what we want to do is we want to add a header for the site. For that, we'll use a header element, particularly the largest one, which is the H1. So if you type in H1, and we have created a H1, and we'll say learn HTML. And there we go, the first bit of text on the web page. And what we'll do to accompany that is add a paragraph text. So this is like the body text of the site. And this element here is another widely used HTML element, and it just essentially adds text to your site. So what we're going to do is we're going to put by curious byte, and boom, we now have these two elements. Now as you notice, once I added the last one, it essentially pushed itself below this one and created its own space, as is the nature of a block element. Both the H1 and the P are block elements. Now if I was to change them both to a span, which are inline, they would then suddenly be on the same line, and they wouldn't be competing for space and trying to have their own space, but we will revert that back to a block element for both for now. And now that we've assigned hello world as a class, we can actually use that now. So HTML has its own ability to style a document. We can do that by adding style blocks at the very top of the body element. So we'll do that now. And to access this class here within the style blocks, to actually do something with it, we will add a dot, and the dot denotes that this is a class. And we'll add some curly mustache brackets here, which is what you use for CSS, which is slightly different to the pointy brackets that you use for HTML. And what we'll do is we will set the color of the document to purple. And there you go. Now, we've added a div, but in reality, that's not essentially what we want. What we want to do is make sure that we're writing semantic HTML. So as this is its own little section, what we're going to do is we're going to set it as the header. So now that is the header of the site. And then what we want to do is just below here, we want to add a separate section. And we want to denote that it is separate. And we will add a H2 element, so another header, but it's lower down in the size rankings. And we are going to say learning HTML. And what we'll do is we'll add some lorem ipsum text just to throw that in there. And what we now have is a bit of content to the site. Now what you might have noticed is that these two headers are slightly different. They are both headers, but one is a H1 and one is a H2. Now the browser by default adds its own default stylings. So the H2 has a size of 1.5 EM and the H1 has a size of 2 EM by default that the browser gives it. Now there are ways to reset that when you create a page if you don't want the default styling, or you can set it to your very own, and that's called using reset style sheets. And you essentially reset the base styling and then you add your own. But that's for a future video. All you need to understand for now is that the browser adds default styling to your HTML. So with that, we will go down here and we will add a footer to finish off the site. And we will add, let's add a B tag with Curious Byte. And what we'll do in here is we will use a span tag. A span tag is almost like a div. It's kind of a very commonly used HTML element. It is very much a throwaway element because it's almost like an anything element. It's just used for anything. It's super common and it's not very specific to any use case. So you wouldn't probably use it that often. For example, we've used it to set the copyright here, but in actuality you could just get away with using something else. So for example, if we want to make that bold, we can just add the strong tag here and then we can make it bold. We may not want to. If we want to, for example, make this an underline, we could add a class to the span, for example. So we could add a class like underline, and then up here add a specific styling to that span, which is one of the commonly used uses of a span. And we'll use text decoration underline. And what that does is that adds an underline. So there's a lot of good use cases for span, and it's a good tool to have in your belt. I hope that helped with your understanding of HTML. Now in this video, we'll be looking at more advanced HTML topics. So we'll start off by looking at meta tags. Now meta tags go within the head element and they provide metadata about the HTML document itself. They're typically used to specify things like a character set, a page description, keywords, author of the document, or just viewport settings for different devices. So let's add a meta tag, and we'll start off by adding a character set. And we'll do that by creating a meta element like this, adding a character set, and setting it to UTF-8. Now UTF-8 stands for Unicode Transformation Format. And one of the best things about this, and it was something that was created by the Unicode Consortium a while back, in the grim old days of the internet, there was only a very limited character set called ASCII. And ASCII only worked with basically English or Latin character sets. Nowadays, you'll have Chinese character sets, you'll have Arabic character sets, and all kinds of character sets around the world. Essentially use all of them now within UTF-8. So that's the benefit of it. It gives that power to your website, and you want it on every single web page you make. Trust me. Now, speaking of characters, one thing that you do need to be aware of is that there is a reserved character list in HTML. So if we have a look here, the ampersand, the less than sign, and the greater than sign in the quote is actually a reserved character. Now, the reason being is if we go here, for example, and if we are to type in a less than sign, you'll see that it has an immediate effect. The code editor itself thinks it's now a HTML element. And if we go here, the HTML text has disappeared. And if we have a look into it, we can see it now considers the H1 to be a HTML element. And all we've done is we've just added this less than sign. So we have to be very careful how we go about this. Now, the way to counter this and to be able to use reserved characters like this is using what we call HTML entities. And all you do is you add an ampersand. And if we get rid of that, and then we type in less than, or LT, we should now be able to add the less than sign. So a HTML entity comprises of three things: the ampersand, the HTML entity within the middle, and the semicolons. And if we go here, we can have a full list of all the HTML entities. So if you want a left arrow, you can have that. If you want an up arrow, that's the HTML entity for that, and so on and so forth. There's a whole bunch out there, and there's all kinds of symbols and characters that you can add to your website through HTML entities. But it's a great way of getting past the reserved character list. So we'll get rid of this for now. But let's have a look at making a form. We'll start a form here. We'll create a form element, and by itself it won't do anything. What we'll need to do is we'll need to put some other form elements within it to actually do something. There are many different elements and very different variations of those elements that you can use. So what we'll do is we'll pop in an input element, and we'll add a type of text. And what this does is it adds a HTML element on the right here into the web page, and you can simply just type any text into here, and it works just great. You can even type numbers as well. Doesn't matter what you do, it'll turn it all into a string, which is just text basically. So that's all well and good, but what if we want to add a input where you can only put numbers in them? Now this is useful when you're creating a form that needs to have a telephone or mobile phone capture. So if we go in here and we simply do the same that we did last time, but instead of text, we will put number. And then what we get, an input where you can only put numbers in. So if I try to type characters, which I'm trying now, I can't put any in. But if we put numbers in, it works great. And this is great for mobile phone capture. Now the problem with that is we've got two inputs right next to each other that look very similar, but it's hard to differentiate which is which. Now there's a few ways to tackle this. We can add some labels, which would look like this. So we add a label element like that. And then if we add, let's say for example, name, and then we'll add number here. Let's add telephone actually. Let's put that. And what this has done is this has created a name label and a telephone label. Now by itself, that won't really work when the form goes more to completion. What we need to do is we need to connect these labels and these inputs together. And the way you do that is you add a name to your input. So for this, we'll add name. And for this input here, we'll add a name of telephone. And then if we go to label here, we'll type in for telephone. And that essentially has connected these two together. So when the form is ready and has logic in it, that this will actually work now. So if we go for, and we will go, oh, not telephone again, we'll go name. Brilliant. So those are both connected up and they're working great. So those are both connected up and they're working great. So let's add another input. Now just to note, there are many different types of inputs. If we go down here, we can see that there's buttons, there's checkboxes, there's dates, there's emails, there's files. You can do file picker, you do date pickers, color pickers. The list is endless. In fact, let's show you a color picker. So if you see there, very simple: input, type, color. And we've added a name, which is what we've already added before, and an ID. Now we don't need that for now, just for demoing purposes. We'll have a look over here, and if we click this, we now get a color wheel. And we can set any color we want. We get this out of here. Brilliant. So another good input to add is a checkbox. And this is something you'll probably use quite a lot. So another thing we can add is a checkbox. And this is quite handy if, you might have some terms and services you want them to agree to. So we'll add another label here and we'll say terms and services. And we'll add a name here for that. We'll put do you agree to our terms and services, and that's come up there. Now what we want to do is we need to add a few more elements to make this a proper form. So we'll add an email address, and we can do that by simply changing the type here to email, and we'll give it a name of email, and we will also add a label for it. Oops. So now we have a very basic form, but inputs aren't the only thing you can add in a form element. There are some other cool features that you want to create in a form. So if, for example, we want to create a drop-down menu, there are a couple options. You can either use a select drop-down, in which it's a bit like an unordered list. So you have your select drop-down, and you can already see that that's popped up here. And then we can add some options. So we'll add an option of choice 1, let's say, for example. And we'll add a couple, so we'll add, well, a few. So we'll add 3 choices. So then if we go here, it will say choice 1, choice 2, choice 3, and that's a very, very quick and simple drop-down menu. So now that we've finished this form off, one thing that will come apparent if you're building along is that it's just a load of inputs and drop-down menus and checkboxes. There's not much to do with it. Well, if we want to submit this information, we'll need a button. One thing about a button element is it doesn't necessarily have to be kept within a form. You can actually use a button element outside of a form. So if we go into this section here and we type in button and we type in submit, for example, we can see that there's a submit button here now, and it's outside of a form and it works just great. But what we want to do is we actually want to place that within the form. So we'll bring that all the way down into the form below the terms and services checkbox. So now we have that like this, which is brilliant. You may have noticed that there's no real functionality to this form for now. All it does is it just refreshes the page and doesn't do much more than that. And that's because we need JavaScript to add functionality to this form, or some other kind of logic to essentially add something for this form to do. Right now it's just a very skeletal form. Other than layout, there's nothing to it. So that's our form for now. It isn't functional, but that's not a problem. We'll go back and we'll add some logic and we'll add some styling and we'll tidy that up just fine. So one great thing we can do in HTML is add links in between the page. So we can actually have links that jump us around the page to specific sections. If we were to go to the footer, for example, we can have a link that sends us to the top of the page. So if I was to add an anchor tag here, which is the A element or the A tag, and then we'll say let's go to the top. Now here you can see that we've added a hashtag, which denotes that we are targeting an ID. So in the first video, we looked over classes. So if you can see here that we have a class of underlined, which is a selector for an element. There is another form of selector for an element that we can use called an ID. So yeah, as you can see, we've targeted that. We'll put in top here, and then if we go up, we'll add that ID here to the header. So simply to add an ID to a HTML element, all you do is type ID, and it's just the same as class, except that you will type in top. And this is selectable in CSS and in JavaScript. So this can be targeted by multiple different coding languages. So let's give this a try. Now the one problem is the page itself isn't very long. So we'll pad it out a bit, and we will add some elements just to add some padding. So we'll add some break elements just to give it some space. So now you can see that this is down here. We'll add a few more. So now you can see the top is here. And if we left click this, it'll take us all the way to the very top. But let's say, for example, we don't want to go all the way to the very top. We want to go to a different section. So let's go here, and we will create a H2 called middle of the page. And then we will add an ID of middle. And let's change that to middle. And let's add some more spacing. So now we have the middle of the page here, and we have the top. Let's change this to middle as well. Why not? So if we click middle, then it takes us to the middle of the page. Let's have one for top as well. And let's go to the top now. And that takes us to the top. And it's a great little tool to help navigate within the website. Now you wouldn't just simply do a straight jump to the top because it's very jerky. You would add some kind of animation, and you would slow it down and maybe add some bounce. But that's an entirely separate video, and that's an entirely separate skill set in itself to add animation to a website. So we will get rid of this one for now, and we will get rid of all this, and we will keep that. So what we're going to do, we just want to tidy this up. I'm going to add word wrap to this. A lot of people don't like to have word wrap because they like to have everything on the same line, and that's how I prefer to work as well, because I like to know that if I'm looking at a line, it is that line. But just for demoing purposes, I just want to show you all the code. So we're just going to try and show you as much code as possible for this next bit. Now, when creating a website, the need may arise to add a video. And the simplest way to do that is to add a video element. And what we want to do is, if we look here, it's immediately taken the space. We want to actually increase the size of it, and we want it to be 100% width. And you can do that with the width attribute and a height attribute. So it's very similar to image in that sense. And we want to add a placeholder image. Now on a video, it's called something slightly different. It's called a poster. So if we add a poster, we'll add a poster from placehold. So we'll go to placehold, and we will say, let's say 1200 by 500. Yep, that fits the space. Now we also want to add the source to this video. So we'll go down here, put this on another line, and we'll go here and we'll add the source just so it wraps in nicely. We'll go and grab the movie source, and we'll pop that in there. Now we also want to set the type of video. Now this particular type of video will be an MP4. Now one thing you might realize is that it's just the poster for now. But what we need to do is we need to add controls. So once we've added controls, you can see immediately it now becomes a video. It even has the video time length here, the start time, the volume, the full screen, all kinds of options. And it comes with its own sets of default animations. We've not added any CSS, JavaScript or styling, but you've got video functionality built into HTML. So let's give this a test. So let's press play. Oh. And there you can see it's working just fine. Brilliant. Now we might not want to have the video in line like this. We might want to have multiple video sources. And the way we handle that is if we open this up like this and we take the source from here and we say we are going to add a source element within here. Now a source element is similar to an option element within a select, in that it is an option to this video to choose this source. And you can have different reasons for choosing the source, but in this case we will just say that the source will be, oh, we've already added that. We'll add it like this. So that's added the type and the source, and that's brilliant. Let's tidy this up a little bit. Now a great use for source is, for example, if you want multiple sources, if one source goes down. So if one source goes down, you have another video in its place, and if that goes down, you have a third one, etc., etc. So you never really miss out if something happens. It's great for just making sure that there is a video of some kind, even if it's just like an error video or something. You'd have a placeholder video. That's the benefits of using source, and that's how you add videos to a website. We'll just indent this a little bit. Okay, and let's give this a whirl. Okay, well, that seems to have an issue. Okay, so this I think has been tabbed. So let's go back. Yep, it's been tabbed. Just sort that formatting out. Brilliant, and then we're back. And let's give this a whirl as well. Yep, and that's working too. Brilliant. So that is videos. So what we'll do now is we will add an image to the website, but we've already added an image in the first video, but we'll do it slightly differently. We're going to use a similar method that we used for the video here to have multiple sources for the picture. So we'll start by adding an image, a default image, using the image tag, and we will use a slightly different website than we normally use. We've normally used placehold. Let's use place kitten. So let's have a 200 by 300 kitten. Oh, actually the 200 one was quite cute. Let's just stick with that one. And we'll put a confused cat as the alt tag. So the alt tag is simply just a description of what the image is. We can actually add a title for this picture. So when you hover over it, it should actually say something. So if we put a confused kitten, it should say a confused kitten. Now we've got our image source. What we want to do is add a picture element. So similar to video, we'll add that, open that up and pop this inside. And that works just the same. And what we'll do now is we will add another source for this video, and we'll do it using a source attribute. So let's give it an image source, and we will use place kitten again. And let's go up in size. Let's use 400. And we have another cute cat. Let's say that after mobile, this is what gets shown, and we can do that by saying that after this media width, we want to show this image. So you can be very clever how you show these images. So you can say after 420 pixels, I want to show this image. Probably don't need that. There we go. And then we get that image showing instead of that, even though that is the default image. Now let's add another source, and let's say The minimum width will be 720 pixels, and we will use a 700 cat. Now this is a mega cat. Oh, multiple cats. And we can actually show that in work. So if we go here and we just switch to a side dock, we can actually watch this in action. Boom. And there you go. That is picture elements. So another great thing HTML can do for you, it automatically fits the space as best as it can. However, if you don't want to do that, there is an element for pre-formatted text, so you don't have any pre-formatting. And it's great for showing code or somewhere where you can have text that you've got line spacing, lines in odd places and tabs and things. So I'll show you an example. We put some code in here. It'll show without any of the normal HTML. So for example, if I was to take this and put it in a p tag, it would show like this. But in a pre-formatted element, it allows you to retain all the lines, all the tabs, all the indentations and everything. It's a cool little element that HTML comes packing with. So before we finish up, I just wanted to go over a couple cool features that we've missed out on that HTML5 has added. One of those is required, which is an input attribute to make sure that that input is required by the form. So when we click submit, it should tell us that this is required. And it simply types in like this, and then we put in required again, and that'll be the name attribute here. That'll be the name input here, and then we click submit. Boom. As we haven't filled it out, it's not happy and it's given us an error. So if we type in a name, then we click it and it's happy and it's fine. But we also want the email to be required as well. So we'll add that here. But we don't really want the telephone. We're not too bothered about that. So we could just enter it as an empty one, which basically means it's not required, or we can just leave it altogether. Now the other great thing that was added was placeholder attributes. With inputs, you can actually set a default value and a default placeholder. For example, with an input, we could say the default value is first name. So by default, you can see that the first name is set to first name, but it's something that you can delete and you can edit and it still actually stays there. So for example, if you don't delete it all, part of whatever the value was gets submitted as well, which isn't what you want. A better alternative is using the new HTML5 input attribute of placeholder, and you can see immediately that the styling has changed and it isn't a value in itself. If I was to type in a name, we can then see that come up there. And that's essentially how placeholder attributes work. So two very cool features of HTML5 which I recommend you playing around with. Having a look at just in general some of the amazing attributes that input has. So another cool feature before we go is the progress bar. So we can simply add a progress bar with HTML very simply by adding a value. Now by itself it doesn't mean much, it's very static. Static meaning it's not moving, it's not doing anything. Without JavaScript, without logic being used on this, it's pretty dead. And what we can do is we'll add a label for this. We'll add an ID of file. And we'll say form progress. We'll say 25%. In a later video, we'll come back and we will sort this out and we will add some logic to it and make it actually work. So as you fill out the form, this should fill up as well. So I hope that was useful. That wasn't quite everything. There are nuances to every different element and different versions and different things you can do, but this should give you a very strong understanding of some of the more advanced HTML features out there. Hey everyone, let's go through some HTML best practices now. I've put together a list of 9 HTML best practices, and I believe every front-end developer should know these as a rule of thumb as how to manage your HTML. And these are 9 rules that will last you throughout your entire career. So let's start with the very first one on the list, and that is Number one, using only one H1 element per page. So the idea is that this H1, this heading element here, should only be used just the once. And that's because H1 is very special compared to the other headings. So, you know, your other headings like H2, H3, all the way up to H6. Everything beyond H2 is fine to repeat. So you can have multiple H2s. That is fine. But generally, you only want to have one H1. Now, why is that? Well, the reason why is because H1 is very important to the browser and very important to accessibility tools like screen readers. So disabled people or people with sight impairments or some kind of impairments to using the web, they would typically use a screen reader to read the website from top to bottom. And a H1 really helps describe the website to them and describes not so much the website, but the page itself. So the page they're on is described by a H1. It's a big indicator of what it's about. And if you have multiple H1s, it can be really confusing. So in this example here, we do have a H1. We also have a H2 and a H3 in order, and that's great. But then if you start doing something like this, and you have a H1 here and then a H1 at the bottom of the page, it doesn't make any sense to the browser or the screen reader and can be really confusing and is considered for that reason a bad practice. So try to avoid this and try to only use just the one H1, but that is a rule just for that heading element alone. The rest are fair game to use multiple times depending on if it makes sense. So number two, use semantic elements for headers. So if you've gone through the other videos, you've probably gone over what semantic elements are. Just like this, it makes sense that we use for our header and things like the nav semantic elements. And this is again for the very same reason we just mentioned for the H1, is that this is communicating to the browser and to screen readers for accessibility reasons what your website and what sections of your website are doing. Now, in accessibility terms, sections of your websites are considered as widgets. So the header is a widget. So if you give it a very semantic name as header, and if you give your navigation section a semantic name nav, it becomes very clear to the browser and very clear to the screen reader what you're actually showing, what the user is actually interacting with, and then it can read it out aloud or basically show it in the browser properly. Just to be clear, semantic elements, to go over it again, is that it is trying to make the element a lot more human readable, a lot more clearer, and a lot more easier to understand what it is. So for example, this navigation element you could easily do as a div, and this is how a lot of people write code, and it's considered a bad practice. And you want to make sure that your HTML is as semantic as possible. And you know, this again could be done as a div and it would still work, but you want to make it semantic. So these are all native HTML elements that are understood by the browser and screen readers. So that is number two. Number three, so do not skip heading levels. So when we say heading levels, we're talking about H2s and things like that. This doesn't necessarily matter too much for H1 because H1 is always at the top. But generally, if you're writing code, you don't want to have a H2 and then suddenly have no H3 and then just have a H4. That wouldn't make too much sense to the browser, and it wouldn't make too much sense to screen readers because they wouldn't know which order these bits of content are basically in. You've got a H1, a H2, and then it would expect a H3 as the next level of importance, and then you'd confuse it by adding a H4. For that reason, it's considered a bad practice, and generally you need to keep it in order for that reason. So like here, we've got a H2 and then we've got H3s. That would make sense. Okay, number four, use the figure element for images with captions. So this is mostly for semantic reasons and for accessibility reasons. So the figure is obviously a semantic element in which it describes something. So it would be describing this image. So we have a fig caption here, which is a child element of figure. And what this does is it describes the image. And this is just considered a best practice But if you're using an image and you want to add some kind of caption, and also obviously adding alt text does help as well. And these are all considered good HTML and accessibility practices. So make sure that if you are using an image practice and you want to add captions for it, that you use the figure element. That is number 4. Number 5, use semantic elements for the footers. So similar to above, always make sure that you're not just having your footer as its own component where it's a div. Make sure you are using the footer semantic element just again for browsers and for screen readers, just as a best practice. So same as the header. That is number 5. Number 6, avoid using divs as inputs. So now this is easily done when you're starting out. This is how you should do it. So let's say, for example, you have a form, you have a label, and then you have an input. This is just a text input where you put text into, and it's very clear what this is. It's got its ID, it's got the type of input it is, and it's got a name for it so it can be referenced. So yeah, that's a proper input element there. Now, an incorrect use of creating a input is like a button. So for example, if you create a button with a div, so you declare a div, and then you basically start using it as a button, because you can add on-click handlers to a button, and sorry, a div. That is considered a bad practice. Now, to counteract this, you can also add a role of button, which would then make sure that this does work for accessibility and for browsers, and it can be read better. But again, it will still complain. It will also ultimately give you a warning and saying, yeah, this isn't a best practice. What you really should be doing is making sure that this is a button, and then that will work just fine. And that role that we added is automatically done under the hood, behind the scenes by the browser. You don't need to worry about that. So yeah, avoid doing this. This is very much a bad practice. So you need to use the correct elements. Number 7, avoid using the B and I elements for styling, so bold and italic elements for styling. And the reason being is we should be using CSS, bold and italics. The reason being is that this isn't considered semantic by the browser, and it has issues actually reading what is italicized, I guess, if that's a word, and made bold. So yeah, just a general practice is to make what you want bold and italic through this. Now, for example, if you didn't do it like this, you could, if you want to emphasize a particular word, you could do this. Yeah, that is considered a best practice. So ensure that you do use styling instead, emphasize it. And if you need to emphasize particular points, then you. Number 8, do not place block level elements within inline elements. So this is a really, really basic one. And people still get it wrong many, many years after. So it's really good to nip this in the bud at the really early stages of your career and of your coding knowledge. And that is the idea that certain elements are block elements. So this is, for example, a block element, and this is going inside a div. And what a block element essentially means is that it requires its own line of like space on the website. So it takes its own space on the website. So for example, if you had HTML from top to bottom, this would be its own line, and then this would be its own line as well. So for example, this here is an inline element, and that is going inside this block element here. And that is considered the way you generally do it. And what you want to avoid doing is something like this. So this is an inline element, and then you're putting a block element within that, which is incorrect, and you want to avoid. It doesn't really make sense, and it is an incorrect usage of a block element. So that is one to remember. And this will get picked up by ESLint. This will get picked up by a lot of things. Most companies and people have in their projects. So this will get flagged up straight away by all those. And generally, a lot of those places won't even allow you to push the code up. Cool. And finally, number 9, always use alt attributes for images. So as we saw earlier when we were looking at figure elements, Images should have a alternative text, and this is considered a best practice for several reasons. For browsers, for people who may have sight impairments, so things like due to anomaly or things where they've got blurred vision. So great for accessibility. This describes the image that you're looking at. That's all it does. So it describes the image that you're looking at. Now, for someone without a screen reader, all you would do is you would use your mouse to hover over the image and you would see the text there. So the text that you put in really should be describing the image and not just a general description of the content, I guess, in a way, or a general description of what you're trying to use the image for. It should be a description of the image. So very important distinction there. It has to be a description of the image, and that is considered a best practice. There we go. Those are all 9 of our HTML best practices. If you follow these, you should be on your way to beating most people who have been making these mistakes for years in their career. So stick to these 9 and you'll be way ahead of so many other senior and mid-level developers. So as you can see here, we're using Visual Studio Code. Now, just as a note, Visual Studio Code comes with Emmet by default. It's one of the benefits of using VS Code. If you're using a text editor or code editor like Atom or Sublime, you will need to download Emmet from emmet.io and install it manually. So let's jump into Emmet and have a look at some of the superpowers it can give us. And where better to start than by looking at creating a HTML website itself and the basic structure of a website. Now, the skeletal structure of a HTML website, you would argue, is a doc type. You want to start with that and you want to declare it as a HTML, and that's fine. Nothing's changed. Emmet hasn't brought anything new there just yet. But if we were to decide, let's create the HTML tag itself, this is where Emmet starts to come in. Now, normally you would do the less than sign and you would type in HTML and you would close it, and then you would have to type in the end tag as well. Now, Visual Studio Code auto completes it for me, but there are other benefits. You can, in Emmet, simply type HTML and press tab and it will auto complete HTML for you. But it also places the cursor perfectly within the tags so that you can carry on and keep coding. So let's create the head in the same way. Type head, press tab, type body, press tab, and we'll put hello world, and we'll wrap that in a p tag as well. Now, right there, you've got the structure of your HTML website, and that was created fairly quickly, arguably a lot quicker than you would doing it natively, but there is an even quicker way. So in Emmet, you can simply create a HTML website by just trying to set the doc type. So you put an exclamation mark and you press tab, and there you go, you get the entire website. It's great for testing, great for side projects. It's even great for work, really, if you're creating a HTML structure from scratch. It just gives you a lot more power and strength. And already you're starting to get an insight into how quick you potentially could be using Emmet. And we've only looked at just a few elements here. So again, like above, creating single elements is super simple. Like, for example, you want to create a div, if you want to create a span, or if you want to create a H1, very simple. Now, where we go off and we start to do some more interesting things is, for example, if we want to add some text to an element. Let's take a button element, for example. So if we were to create a button element and we want to say, have it say submit in the center, you simply do that and press tab, and then we've got submit in the center. And you can do this with anything. Oops. And it works perfectly. Another fantastic feature of Emmet is that it has a lorem ipsum generator. Now, lorem ipsum is traditionally used as dummy text for designs and for development work. So if you need some text just as a placeholder, just to show the shape of a layout, just to show what it would look like with text and to show some of the styling, lorem ipsum is perfect for that. And as a developer with Emmet, you will have that superpower very quickly to add dummy text rather than having to go to a website and use a generator. All you simply do is type in lorem and it generates it for you. And you can even type it within a HTML element. So for example, if we were to create a p tag, and then we type in lorem and we press tab, and you get the same exact lorem ipsum there. So it's all well and good wanting to create HTML elements, but realistically you want to add attributes, you want to add class names, and you want to add IDs and things like that. So if we were to create a div here and we want to say, give it a class name of test, and we press tab, we can immediately see that with the same benefits that we got with creating the element, we also are able to add attributes like class to HTML and carry on working. And if we go here and we decide, you know what, well, we actually need to add an ID. So then we can say, let's add an ID of test. And immediately you can see it's the exact same thing. It's a fantastically speedy way of building HTML very quickly. And in actuality, you could just sit there and just completely build out very quickly the entire HTML structure before you even start a website with Emmet, because it just gives you that speed. And you do it so quickly, you're able to iterate. Now, you can add other attributes. So for example, if we were to say, let's add a script, and then we're going to add the source as well. All you need to do is type in the element and add the colon and the name of the attribute. So let's decide we want to create an unordered list. You can do that as well, very simple. But what if we want to create some child elements? Now you could normally just go here and you could type in a list element and press tab, but there is a much quicker way. You can type unordered list, and then you can do a list item and simply press tab. And doing so with the more than sign essentially nests this element. So if we do that again, we'll do that here, and we'll add a class name this time. So if we do unordered list and we do a child selector, and then we say list item, and then we will add the class name of item, and then we press tab, you can see we can even affect the child elements as well. Now you don't always have to add, when you're adding a class name, the actual element that you want to do. It's very implicit that you want to add a list item if you're going to do that. So within an unordered list, if you want to add a list item, you can just simply say, we'll add item again, and it will create a list item for us. And you can do that for many things. Now here's where it really starts to take off. You can already start to see we're starting to produce like a collection of Emmet abbreviations, and you're starting to produce formulas. In this one, we're going to use multiplication, and we're going to multiply the amount of child elements that we want. So if we say we want a child element of item as a class name for a list item for an unordered list, and we want 5 of those, let's say, and we press tab, you can see that we have created 5 list items for an unordered list. Okay, it's all well and good having class names for each individual one, and you might want them all to have the same class name because you want them all to have matching styling. That's great. But what if you want them all to have a slightly different styling? Well, the way you do that is you can add a unordered list item, you can add the item again, but if we add the $sign to say that we want this to be a variant of the one before it by 1, and it will just one up that, let's say, by a number. So if we say let's do 5 of these, you can see each one now has a slight variation of 1, and it's a fantastic tool you can use to basically create individual class names, and you can do that for attributes and so on and so forth. Now we've had a look at multiplication, but you can also add class names together. Now we've had a look at multiplication, but you can also add elements together. So if we were to go here and we were to say list, and then we'll add a list item of item, and we will then within that create a span, and we will say that can have a class list of micro, and then within that we will add a p tag, and we'll add paragraph as the text, and we'll times that by 10. And you can see that within that structure, within that formula, we have created a big set of markup exactly how we wanted and what we needed. For example, if we wanted to do a slight variation to that, but let's say for example we want to group elements together. So we've created one huge structure from start to finish with a wrapping element, and it's all contained within here. But let's say we want to create two elements, and within them you can have whatever you want. So now if we want to group two sets of HTML elements together and also produce it within the same formula, so very simply we'd use parentheses like this, and let's create a section. We'll have a div, we'll have a paragraph text within that, we'll have, let's say, 5 of those, and outside of that what we'll do is we'll create a footer with a paragraph text, and we will have a copyright bit of text within there. And if we press tab, immediately you can see that we've created a section with its own grouping and its own HTML elements, and we've created a footer with its own elements and its own content. And it's a fantastic way of producing content really fast and very detailed. So one of the last things we're going to look at is input elements. Now, input elements are fantastically diverse. There is a huge range of input elements. You could have color pickers, name inputs, you could have email inputs, you could have text inputs, all with their own validation, all with their own base styling and features and logic. It's fantastic. So if we were to put in here input color and press tab, you get all the benefits of Emmet and more. It's created 3 attributes for you. It's filled in one as color, and all we've simply done is type input color, and that's it, and it's produced the above. And obviously you've got your all favorites, you've got text, which is implicit, you don't need to put that, you could just put input and it will do that for you. But let's say for example if you wanted number or if you wanted email, it's all there for you. So that's a general idea of what Emmet is, how it can make your HTML workflow absolutely rapid. I would highly recommend to just open up a HTML file once you've got Emmet and just have a play around. So one of the lesser known features of Emmet is its CSS abbreviations. So if, for example, we wanted to create a margin of 10 pixels, we would normally just create it like that. We'd type out the whole thing, add 10 pixels. In Emmet, all you need to do is you need to press M, and then you can set the margin very quickly and just press tab, and you get to this stage here where you can start creating CSS. But there is an even quicker way. If you were to type M and then put the value in, you also are able to set the margin of your CSS line a lot quicker. So if you can imagine, it will over time speed up your process and your flow. But where it does get better is, for example, if you want to add X and Y styling and dimensions to your margin. So if you want to say, do this, you want to say 10 pixels by 20 pixels, so 10 pixels on the top and 20 pixels on the bottom. The best way to do this is by simply doing M10 to 20. And doing that very quickly spun up something that probably would have taken you twice as long. It is a great way of speeding up your workflow and something that I would highly recommend. So if, for example, we're using Sass or if we're using variables in CSS in general, there is a way to include that in your workflow too. So we wouldn't quite do it like this, like we did before, but let's say, for example, if we did have a variable for 10 pixels, we would put that here. And then if we did have a variable for 20 pixels, we'd also put that there. Now the major difference is, if you remember, we made it as a range when we did 10 to 20. We get rid of that here. And all we need to do is just add the second variable, press tab, and you can see it has created our margin and our CSS with the variables perfectly, as we would see in Sass. Now you can also do things like add colors very quickly. We'll just hide this for now as it isn't CSS. We'll say let's add a background color of black, let's say. So we'll add 0 here, and you can add hex colors and simply tab, and it will add the entirety of the hex color. Now obviously you'd probably argue, oh yeah, adding black with the hex code of lots of zeros is super easy. That's nothing useful. I wouldn't probably type in all of that anyway. But you can do something like this, for example, with slightly different hex codes, and you can repeat yourself. It's not entirely useful, but you can explore that. You can improve on that if there are certain colors that you enjoy, but it is still an abbreviation and a shortcut. You can also do things like add a font weight. So if we decided we wanted to add a font weight of 400. Now let's say, for example, we wanted to make sure that this font weight was important for whatever reason. Let's say we're overriding JavaScript or a CSS module. We can simply go, let's add a font weight of 600 and add the important tag. So we can go like that, and then we've added the important modifier. Now, similar to HTML, Emmet, you can also do groupings. You can, for example, say I want this to have a padding of 10 to 20 pixels. We want to make sure that's important. And then we also want to add a margin of 20 pixels. And you can see very quickly we've just added 2 bits of styling, far quicker than we would have been able to add by manually typing that all out. So I would highly recommend introducing Emmet into your CSS workflow as well. And you can immediately see some of the benefits that will make you a much faster front-end developer or a much faster designer, and just level up your HTML and CSS game altogether. So aside from HTML and CSS abbreviations, Emmet also comes with a host of actions. And some of these can be used, for example, to copy a line. So you could copy a line like that and make as many copies as you want. You can shift it around. So if I wanted to shift this one line and bring it all the way down here and traverse it through the document, I can do. I can also, for example, if I wanted to, just comment all that out with command /. There's a whole list of actions that Emmet gives you, and I would highly recommend exploring the whole list. To do so, what you need to do is go to docs.emmet.io here and take a look at the action section. And if, for example, we want to just toggle comments, which we've already shown, we just press command /. If you want to, for example, split or join a tag, so something like that, you could split it. So something like, if you want to remove a tag, the whole list is here. There's a whole fantastic group of actions that I would have a look at and explore, and make sure that you do include those in your workflow. One of the most useful ones are toggle comment, split join tag, and merge lines, where essentially you can bring everything onto one line if need be. So another really cool one is in CSS, you can reflect all the vendor prefixed variations for Firefox, for WebKit, for Internet Explorer, Opera, etc. with Command B. So I hope that's been useful and that you've gained something from that. Make sure to introduce this into your workflow and rapidly increase your HTML and CSS game. Adding images to your Visual Studio Code project. I'm going to show you how you can add images to any website you're creating in the most simplest of ways. And I'm going to show you the multiple ways you can do it. And we'll start off by going to grab the image. So let's just choose a random image. So something like this. Right click, save as, and I'll just put random image here as a name. Now you can do multiple things. You can put it in the folder that you want by opening it up and finding it where it is. Or you can just put it into your downloads folder. So we'll do that and we'll open it up. So depending on what browser you have, you should have a downloads icon. And then just open that up. You should see where it is. So I currently have this in my downloads folder. So I'll open this up. So I've got my downloads folder in one window. And then I'm going to open up a new window. So I'm using macOS, you might be using Windows. But all you need to do is open up another window with your folder. So this is my folder where I have my project, where I have my website. And I double left click that and I will then create another folder within here called images. You don't have to do this, but it just helps with organizing your images. So then you drag the image over here and put it within there. And then if we go into Visual Studio Code where you've opened your project, you can now see you've got an images folder. And if I open that up, I've got the image here. And if I click it, I should be able to see it. Now to link it, you need your image element, as you know. And within the source attribute here, all we do is we put a dot and a // and it should be able to start navigating you to your images. You can see it's opened up 3 little icons here. We're going to go to the images folder. It's going to show us the image there, and then we'll select that, and there we go. We've added our image to our website. Now there is another way to do it. So if I delete this, if I go back here, open this and delete this, I'll show you the other way of doing it. So I'll also delete this images folder. So let's imagine you've downloaded your image that you liked. So we've done the first step. Now the second step is this. So you go into Visual Studio Code and you create a new folder called images. And then instead of going and doing it in Windows or Mac OS, you can right click on here and click Reveal in Finder, or it might be Reveal in Explorer if you're on Windows. And then if you click Reveal in Finder, it should open up the folder for you. And then you simply double left click into there, and now you're in the images folder. And similar to how we did last time, or you could drag and drop it into here, and now you've got the image again. So that's the second way. There is a third way as well. So I'll move this back over here. So this is the third way of installing it. So we'll delete this folder again. We'll start from the beginning. So the third way to add an image to your project is type in images in a new folder, and then open up your image. We'll close this. Then open up images here, grab this image and drag it over to the folder. And you can simply do it like that as well. Whichever way is easiest for you, that's absolutely fine. And it works just the same either way you do it. But those are the 3 ways I would add images to your project in Mac OS or Windows. So now you know a little bit of HTML, we're actually going to build your very first HTML project. So this, for a lot of you, is going to be your very first HTML project or website made at all. And this is going to be pure HTML, no styling, no JavaScript, just pure HTML. And if you're going to make a pure HTML website, why not remake the very first website ever made on the World Wide Web? Now this website was made by Tim Berners-Lee for CERN, and it was to give a little bit of information about CERN as a project and the World Wide Web. So what you'll be building is a little bit of history, and it'll be a great start to your front-end development career. Now the website link is below in this slide image, but I'm going to show you it right now. So this is the World Wide Web's very first website. This is info.cern.ch, and it's a very simple website. It's essentially explaining what the World Wide Web is, or W3 before it became W3C at the time. It's got a header, it's got some paragraph text and some anchor tags, or I guess hyperlinks. Very, very simple and a great place to start. The key thing about this website is if you click a link, so for example hypermedia here, it'll take you to another page. So it links 2 documents together. And that is going to be a key part of your learning for this project, understanding how to link 2 HTML documents together. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown of how that's actually going to work. So let's jump into Visual Studio Code. Now I wouldn't advise using CodePen for this, just because we want to link files between each other through hyperlinks. And you can't really do that in CodePen. It's not very simple to do. So I would advise Visual Studio Code. So this little project icon on the left allows you to browse the files. So you can see that we've got an index.html. That's great. And we need to create our wrapper code for our website. So some of our boilerplate code. Now in Visual Studio Code, they've got something called Emmet. So if you type in doc for doc type and then press tab, it'll create everything for you. So I'll just put here World Wide Web in the title, and then everything else is just boilerplate that comes with a basic website. And then down here in the body, I'm going to put a H1. I'm going to call it World Wide Web. And you can see I've got the preview window open so I can see exactly what I'm doing. I'll make this code a little bigger just so it's easier to read. And once we've done that, let's go back to the website to see what else we need to add. So we've got all this text here. And what we'll do is I'll just add the first line here. So every time you want to add a line, we'll grab that text, come back here, and we'll create a paragraph element. So you can just type P and press tab and it will create that for you. And then you copy and paste the text in. And what we need to look for is hypermedia here, because what we're going to do is we're going to wrap it in some anchor tags. So if we grab this, cut it out, and then create some anchor tags and put hypermedia, that should make it into a hyperlink. But the only way it's going to do that is if we add a href here, and then you can see that it's completely changed styling. It's got an underline, it's gone purple. But the problem is if you click that, it doesn't actually go anywhere. So we need to change that. So how are we going to make it go somewhere? So if we go back into here, into the file browser, I'll just make this a little smaller, and we'll create a new file. We'll create a file called hypermedia.html. Now, whenever you create a HTML file, make sure you end it in .html. Now we've done that. And we'll just create a H1 here, and we'll call hypermedia. Now, obviously, you can go into the website and copy and paste everything exactly how it is, as it is on the hypermedia page. Just doing this for demo purposes. Test hypermedia text content. Okay. And then if we go back to index.html and we then put in a dot, a forward slash, and then it should show us the file that we've just created. And then we press enter once we were on it. And it's linked now to hypermedia.html. Now, the way I clicked onto that is by pressing Control or Command on your keyboard and then left clicking, and it will take you there. So if you want to browse files very quickly, that's a good tip. So that is now set up. So if I go here, I can see now that this link has changed to blue, which means I haven't visited it. When it was purple, it means I have visited it. So now I am going to click hypermedia, and it should take me back to the same page. Now, there is a problem. And this is something that isn't on the CERN website, and you can add yourself. We can add a back button, because now the problem is we've gone to this web page, but we can't go back without pressing the back button at the top, which is okay. And that's probably how they did it back in the day. But if you want, you can add a little improvement onto it if you want to. And that is just up here, we'll add a anchor tag, and we'll put back, and we'll do like a back arrow, and we'll do a href. And what we'll do is we'll just put a forward slash, and we'll do the same as we did before, and then we'll set it to index.html. And then if we click back, it'll take us back to the home page. So now we can easily go back between the pages. And if you create any new page, it might be a good idea to add this back button, but it's totally up to you. You can stay true to how they've done it. If we go to their website and click hypermedia, there's no back button, but it's a nice little improvement that you can add of your own. So yeah, if you basically build out this page and go back and recreate all of these lines. So if you want to create a new line, simply copy this, go back to Visual Studio Code into index.html on a new line. We'll create a paragraph element and paste it in. Now, because a paragraph element is a block element, it's automatically going to create this spacing between paragraph elements for you and give it all the nice spacing that natively comes in your browser with HTML for paragraph elements. So if you ever need to do a new paragraph, I would suggest wrapping it in a paragraph element and then go in and find where you want to add your hyperlinks, create a new page for it here, and link them together. And just practice doing that until you've created this website. Now, you don't need to go and create all of these little mini websites, these mini pages like bibliography. You can if you want to. It could be good practice. But once you've done it a few times, you should be able to get a hang of it. And that is your first HTML project. So the very best of luck, give it a try. And once you're done, you can say you've recreated the very first website made on the World Wide Web.